Towering high above the mountain chain which makes up the southwestern border of China stands Meiliea, a snow-capped mountain, one of the 8 sacred mountains of Tibet. It is also a gateway into Tibet from the Chinese province of Yunnan. The famous Lansang River, known in Chinese as the Mekong, springs forth from the base of this snow-covered peak. Deep gorges, the result of great erosion, ensured that the local population were physically isolated from the rest of the world. Tibetans have lived here for thousands of years, only rarely visited by outsiders. The earliest recorded European visitors to these secluded hills arrived in the early 19th century. They scaled mountains and traversed rivers, suffering extraordinary hardship in pursuance of a single aim, to spread the Catholic faith across Tibet. These Western missionaries who crossed into Tibet all of a century ago sowed seeds of faith which continue to grow. The village of Cizhong, in the northwestern part of Yunnan province, by the river Lansang, is representative of several dozen such Tibetan riverside villages. After the fall harvest, local villagers take advantage of the idle season that follows to repair their homes. Wu Gongdi, a respected member of the community, can always be found working on one or other house in the neighborhood. Though he is called Wu Gongdi in Chinese, his first and last names are neither of these, for both are in fact translations of his Christian names.
My name is Wu Gongdi. My Christian name is Austin. I am 53 years old. My family has been Catholic for 6 generations.
In the village of Cizhong, a 100-year-old church stands proudly in the center. The church is the largest building and marks Cizhong as a Catholic village in the province of Yunnan. The Catholic Church established a diocese in Tibet as early as the 19th century. Located in Cizhong, it represented the church's first step in spreading Christianity throughout Tibet. Completed in 1905, the church in Cizhong was chosen as the center of the Yunnan deanery of the Diocese of Tibet, and a first vicar general was appointed with responsibilities for missionary work throughout the region. Reverend Ouvrard, the first vicar general of Cizhong, is buried in the vegetable yard next to the church, his missionary brothers lying nearby. In 1993, the villagers elected Wu Gongdi, their church caretaker responsible for the Catholic community. Following Tibet's communist liberation, religious activities were banned in mainland China, and all foreign missionaries were expelled from the province. Left unattended, the Cizhong church suffered extensive damage during the Cultural Revolution. Not before the 1980s, when China changed its policy on religion, were religious activities in Cizhong again possible. Wu Gongdi spent years trying to find the church's former relics. Some had been confiscated by the state, whilst others survived in the homes of the faithful.
After being confiscated by the police, much was returned to us in 1983. These items include a stole worn by the missionaries while saying Mass. And these vestments, which the missionaries put on during Mass, were worn by the Reverend Lovey and Reverend Gore. They are extremely precious.
Only a few relics have been found. Many remain unrecovered or were damaged during the Cultural Revolution. For example, on the altar, which was built with stone, every piece was engraved with the Latin characters and exquisite patterns. To date, those retrieved are only fragments, lying here in the storehouse beside the church. The village of Cizhong numbers 600 inhabitants. Over 80% of the families are Catholic. Wu Gongdi visits them occasionally, particularly the elderly. They can still remember as things were in the church before the liberation.
My name is Meiliea. I'm 83 years old. I learned the Tibetan language in the church when I was 7. In the church, the priest did charity work. Our food and clothes came from the church. There were a number of students like me. After liberation, Reverend Gore and Reverend Lovey were both expelled from this province all the way to Weishi.
According to Meiliea, this is Reverend Lovey, whilst this is a unique photograph of Reverend Gore, the only one ever found in the village. These two missionaries, originally from Switzerland and France, arrived in Cizhong in 1930 and worked here for 20 years. Since their expulsion in 1950, no priest has ever returned here. As caretaker of the church, Wu Gongdi works as a lay catechist. When villagers fall ill, he visits them to console and to offer them whatever material support he can. This is a basic interpretation of duty, but one that his faith has instilled in him.
What is God? God is nowhere and everywhere, I suppose. Seeing a patient, I think, this patient is God. Thus, to treat the patient is like treating God. Seeing a poor person, I think, this poor person is God. We have to treat this poor person as God treats him. Though God is invisible, untouchable, God can still see and touch us.
Without religious guidance, Wu Gongdi is obliged to search for knowledge and so to educate himself in the ways of the faith as best he can. He seeks advice from senior lay people. Fortunately, religious publications are now increasingly more widely available in China. Wu feels that a number of faith-related questions can now be better understood and answered through the written word. In Cizhong, the weather is mild. The average annual temperature rarely falls below 10 degrees centigrade or rises above 20. There is sufficient rain and sunshine, and vegetation grows in great abundance. During the half-century that the foreign missionaries were present in Cizhong, they introduced a wide variety of plants which have made Cizhong a plant paradise. The 2 palms in front of the church are the most symbolic of the many new plant varieties introduced by the missionaries, which also includes the banana tree that still stands at the back of the church. Among the various plants, there is one plant that begs a special mention, the vine. In front of the church, one can still see the remains of a vineyard originally planted by the missionaries. In the Catholic Holy Mass, wine turns into the holy blood of Christ. So wherever the missionaries settled to spread the Catholic faith, and as long as conditions were suitable, they also planted the vine. A Frenchman, Reverend Gore, introduced grape seeds and established the first vineyard in Cizhong. After liberation, the vineyard was abandoned, but the grapes survived.
I started to brew my own grape wine in 1998. Why do I like to make wine? Because wherever there is a mission, there is wine. When the missionaries left the village, though there were grapes, wine could not be prepared. In making my own wine, I used the ancient processing techniques. It was taught to Sister Teresa in the presence of the missionaries, and she taught me.
Besides bringing in a harvest for the church, Wu Gongdi planted grape seeds in the grounds of his own house, and so became the village's first peasant vineyard owner. Over the years, Wu Gongdi's wine gained a good reputation in the neighborhood, so much so that villagers began calling him the Grape King. The church was returned to the Catholics of Cizhong in the 1980s. Ever since, a religious gathering is organized here every Sunday. Yet, the absence of a priest means that masses cannot be celebrated. These weekly assemblies are thus limited to prayers and the singing of hymns. As if frozen in time, the prayers and the hymns are all spoken or sung in the Tibetan language, translated one by one and all taught by the Western missionaries. On arriving in this remote region, these missionaries hoped to spread the Catholic faith throughout this land. They learned the Tibetan language and then translated a selection of commonly used Latin prayers and hymns. With these translations to hand, the missionaries then set about spreading the faith. Although their work did not reach every part of the country, their efforts continue to bear fruit to this day. Throughout this mountainous area of northwestern Yunnan, Wu Gongdi organizes and leads the local weekly prayer gatherings. He also conveys any church news to his congregation, as well as promotes a kind of catechism by sharing thoughts about the Catholic faith. With the coming of Christmas, Wu Gongdi organizes a program of events that is a celebration of that unique day.
Brothers and sisters in Christ, Wednesday will be Christmas Day. Today is Sunday. On Tuesday night, all parishioners, please go to the church to pray. Don't bother with your work. On that night, those senior parishioners shouldn't be scared of the cold. Put on more clothes. I'm going to make a fire in the garden so that we may sing Christmas songs and celebrate together. The birth of Jesus is as if one of our babies was born.
Once the Christmas plans are in place, Wu Gongdi travels to the neighboring village of Cizhong to see how the villagers are preparing their church. The distance between the villages of Cizhong and Cizhong is 5 to 6 kilometers. Their Catholic church was built in 1998, and although they number just under 500 inhabitants, over 90% are Catholic. This is a famous Catholic village in the area, and Wu Gongdi visits the village every 1 or 2 months, because Cizhong does not have an equivalent lay person to manage its church affairs. The devout elderly Catholics of the village welcome Wu Gongdi's enthusiasm. Wu Gongdi is as willing to learn as to teach, and very often shares his knowledge of the region's church history with the villagers.
Before liberation, every Saturday the missionaries came to Badong and Sigu, and having said Mass here, returned to Cizhong on Monday. In total, it took 3 days. The church educated a number of the students. They were provided with food and clothes. Also, the missionaries gave the poor people something to eat. When people died, the missionaries gave them a coffin. This is the kind of charity work they did.
The elders still possess several prayer and hymn books given to them by the former missionaries before the liberation.
This book I have kept since I was 7. It is a book of religious catechism. Another is a book of prayer for the deceased, which was published in 1930. The latter is a holy hymn book, used for singing the Our Father.
On December 24th, Christmas Eve morning, the local Catholics of Cizhong start rehearsing the celebration and prayers that are going to be held that evening. The villagers look for attractive fruits to decorate the 2 plastic Christmas trees standing in front of the church. Meanwhile, Wu Gongdi sets up a dozen flower beds in the courtyard with a view to decorating the church grounds with flowers. Wu Gongdi also asks somebody to look for 2 small pine trees to plant on either side of the church entrance, and so ensures that the church will have its own Christmas trees. A fire will be lit tonight. The parishioners will gather together, some will sing, whilst others will dance. For Tibetans, this is the most common way of celebrating a feast day. The parishioners start arriving at the church around 8:30 in the evening. Then the dancing begins. Some dance the familiar cord dance. The steps of the cord dance are simple. People gather in a circle, men and women on opposite sides. They sing when they dance. Men and women sing alternatively, and although the melody is repeated, the lyrics are ever-changing. The dancing ends at 11:30 in the evening, and people go into the church, one by one, to begin the annual Christmas Eve prayers. For the Universal Church the world over, midnight Mass on Christmas Eve, commemorating the birth of Jesus Christ, is a time full of expectations and hope. In Cizhong, with no religious structures, Christmas Eve is also a unique opportunity for the faithful from this and neighbouring villages to be together. With devout hearts, they praise the Son of God, who came down to earth 2,000 years ago in order to sacrifice his life to save the people of the world. Cizhong in August. Rice and corn bloom. The harvest season begins next month. Before the harvest, the village is generally peaceful, except for Wu Gongdi's family, busy grape picking before the season ends. Winemaking has seen Wu Gongdi's family income increase significantly, especially if compared to his fellow villagers engaged in general farming. A growing number have moved to planting vineyards and wine production. With the years, the local wine made from French grapes has become a famous product of the Cizhong region. Wu Gongdi hopes to produce his wine in time for the Feast of the Assumption, a week away. It will be a special occasion this year, as a visiting priest will celebrate Mass in Cizhong on this feast day. Wu is determined to spend some time in the church to make sure that everything is ready. Every year on August 15th, on the Feast of the Assumption, the faithful celebrate what is after Christmas and Easter the year's most important feast day. As there is no priest in the region, the church faithful have asked that an exception be made and that a priest from another region should come and celebrate Mass for them. Their request is not always successful, so that from year to year the villagers never know whether their plea will be realized. Nevertheless, the hope that a priest might be present inspires Catholics from surrounding villages to come. They often travel long distances on foot. Many believers who rarely go to church will attend today's service in Cizhong. The celebrant of today's Holy Mass is a priest from Xi'an. It's his second visit in Cizhong. The Mass is said in Chinese, and though most do not understand, they listen attentively. Wu Gongdi is one of the few in the village who speaks fluent Chinese. During Mass, he translates the Gospel into Tibetan and also reads the readings. The presence of a priest also attracts a number of young Catholics. The elderly hope the priest could come more often, so that the faith would flourish. This is also a concern shared by the Universal Church.
Because of the persecution of the church in China, and in particular during the Cultural Revolution, there are 2 whole generations of priests missing today in China. So that's why we at Aid to the Church in Need appeal to our benefactors to give support, both spiritual and financial, towards the formation of future priests in China.
The priest will leave Cizhong tomorrow, so the faithful gather in the evening to bid him farewell. Even the elderly come. This is not the first time that this young priest has come to this distant village. Yet, once again, the people's enthusiasm and the simplicity of their faith touches him deeply. In China, the clergy cannot carry out missionary work beyond the boundaries of their jurisdiction, every such journey requiring a permit. The priest promises that if at all possible, he will come again next year. Finally, the faithful offer the priest a white hadas, a Tibetan tradition, a way of expressing both gratitude and good wishes. The day after the priest's departure, the villagers of Cizhong once again resume their peaceful daily rhythm, and Wu Gongdi returns to making his wine. Today is an ordinary Sunday. There are dozens of faithful joining in the prayers. In addition to asking God for the fulfillment of their daily needs, the faithful pray especially earnestly for a priest to visit them again. The vineyard in front of the church is not yet in church hands. Unattended for so long, the vines that were planted here by the missionaries of long ago have grown, and their branches are today weighed down by the abundance of grapes. For half a century, the missionaries tried hard to preach the good news in Tibet. They sowed the seeds of faith deep in this soil along the Tibetan border. The missionaries have gone, yet the seeds continue to yield their fruit.